have this. Can I see it? Can you see that all right?
I will, yeah, that's fine.
All right. This is the main track. That's any time that a passenger train has to go off of this main track, they must be preceded by a pilot engine, which goes through the yard. And the reason they do that is because if anything's wrong with that tracks or anything up ahead, they'll have an engine that'll get there rather than a passenger train. And that's an ICC rule. They have to do that.
What's the ICC? What does that stand for?
Interstate Commerce Commission.
Okay.
This switch right here, there's a red block there. Every mile on the railroad, they have a block signal. If you're coming down the road, it's an approach signal. You know that the next one's going to be a stop signal. But if you read an approach signal and then you have another approach signal, you know there's a train ahead of you, but it's moving. So the engineer on this passenger train had an approach block, which would be a mile out from this. And then here they had a red block here. They had a freight train. The caboose was right there, and it was a long train, and the engine was down almost to Crane Avenue. Now they obviously they couldn't hit that. They had a wreck out in Windham, and actually the guy that followed me on the roster was the engineer on that one, and they put a 4-unit diesel clear out in the field.
What year were we talking about?
62. December 28, 1962 is when this happened. They had that wreck out there by Windham, and as I say, they put a 4-unit diesel out in the field. He hit something on a train going the other direction. The passenger train that came through there, they just opened that track up, and he was running late. So he came through there and then came to Kent. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what happened. He said that the brakes didn't work. He said the signal was green. But really, nobody knows what happened. I don't think that he knew what happened. He might have blacked out. Later on, I heard that he had diabetes. He might have momentarily blacked out and didn't even know it. But he ran those two signals. And unfortunately, the crash was about 60 to 65 miles an hour. And he would never have been able to make that turn off anyhow. It would have derailed him. But hitting the engine that I was running and taking that on up this track probably is the best thing that could have happened, because there's a bridge here over the Breakneck Creek, and then there's another bridge, the B&O Railroad. And had he go beyond that, he probably would have ended up down over in one of those embankments. So if you're going to have a wreck, probably that's the best way to have it. Now they had 50 passengers hurt and 11 crewmen. There were no fatalities.
This was a passenger train.
Passenger train, yes. And I'll show you the pictures here. Probably worth 1,000 words, as they say. So we'll get those pictures out and show them. This is the engine of the passenger train. This is very heavy built. This train could hit a semi and probably not get any more than just paint damage. But when they hit something that's as heavy as the railroad engine, then that's a different story. This is the engine that I was running. Now, it had a back end on there, steps and fuel tank and everything in the back, and that was all gone. I don't know where it is. Cleaned out the whole back underside of it. That there was quite a bit of damage to it.
How soon after the wreck were these pictures taken?
Well, this one would have been, the wreck happened about 11 o'clock, I think 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and it's still light, so they had the wrecker on there. As a matter of fact, I was running the engine that got the wrecker out and was starting to clean it up. I did get an injury, but it didn't set in for a while. Now, this is a picture showing the train. That's a train coming in. Well, this is the main where this train a train like that was sitting, and then that accident happened there, and I was going to come down this way and bring him down that rail, but that didn't work out, obviously.
Where was this taken?
This was in the Kent Yard, just on the
This is
east,
in the
east
Old Erie
side,
Yards?
east side of the Kent Yard.
I see.
There's another. Let's see here.
Now, what do you, at the time, you've described the wreck, what do you remember, not about the actual wreck, but as this is unfolding, as you see this beginning to happen? You were,
All right.
you were the conductor, you were the engineer
Yes.
on one of these trains.
Yes.
What do you remember as this is unfolding in front of your eyes?
All right. We were sent out there to, as I say, pilot this train through. I tried to reach him on the railroad or on the radio, and couldn't get any response.
How long in advance of the wreck did you try to reach him?
Oh, right up almost until the wreck happened. He was running pretty late, a couple hours late, trying to make up some time.
You knew this?
No. I didn't. All I knew is that train was coming, and we were going to pilot him past there. And I was sitting in the engine, and it was a clear, cold day in winter, 28th of December. And I turned around and looked, and I said, well, here he comes, and turned back. And I don't know why, but some other reason, I turned around and looked again, and I realized he wasn't stopping. And he started blowing the horn, and you're supposed to, in case of an emergency, you get on that horn and just blow it, and blow it, and blow it, and that's what he was doing. And I jumped out. That's the only thing I could do.
Really?
The older engineers, a couple of them said to me, oh, you should have stuck with it. There's an old saying that when you do that, you hit the cinders. Go back to the steam engine days. So anyway, I jumped out. And he said, you should have stuck with it. I said, did you look at the engine? And he said, no. I said, well, look at it and then decide. Because if I had stayed in there, why, probably an impact like that would probably just snap my neck. Because of my head, no headrest or anything like that. So I saw that he wasn't going to stop, and I jumped out, and of course he hit the engine. They had a hearing on this thing, and they asked him all kinds of questions as to why he ran the signal and all that. He said, well, the signal was, as far as I knew, it was green. And he said, I couldn't get stopped because the brakes weren't working very good. When they inspected his engine, they found a brake in a running position. And he said, well, I must have just put it back there automatically because just the impact would probably put the thing into an emergency situation. On the railroad, each car has their own brakes. It's one of the things where you put pressure in the line, about 65 pounds pressure in the line, and then there's what they call a triple valve. It fills it's what they call a service tank of air in each car, and then they have an emergency tank in each car. And if you throw it into emergency, every car, the brake goes on right away. If you just use a service brake, you just draw down some pressure, and that applies it on the train. The longer the train, where you have hills, it can be difficult to learn, but because of the slack and all that. Anyway, he said that the brakes didn't work right. They said, well, when you came into Youngstown, didn't you report it? He said, well, no. I thought I could handle it all right. And they said, well, obviously you couldn't handle it. You wrecked it. This man worked on the railroad for years, dedicated man. The first time I ran a train on the main track was with him. I would have believed that it was anybody was the engineer on that train but him. And I really felt sorry for him. I don't think anybody knew what happened, really. But,
what happened to him after the hearing?
Well, of course, they let him retire, but...
How old was he?
64.
Okay.
but in effect, they fired him on the spot. They came to me and they said, you know, pretty obvious what happened. I was right where I was, doing the job that I was supposed to do, and there's nothing else I could do. Now, if I would have proceeded down the track, which I could have done, where I keep him in sight, I probably could have got away from him. But I didn't see a lot of purpose in that either, and it's probably a good thing that we didn't, because had I done that, as I say, he probably ended up on a B&O or down Breakneck Creek with it, and I'm certain that there'd be some passenger fatalities.
This seems to me still very vivid in your mind.
Oh, yes. You know, at the hearing, they were asking me questions, and he said, well, now, after you jumped out, did you notice if the brake cylinders were out on his engine as it went by? I don't remember my response, but I think I said, I don't think you understand this at all. You know, you just can't imagine what kind of a crash that is, where you have tons and tons of things coming together, and they estimated the crash at 60 to 65 miles an hour. And
was this a head-on collision?
Well, it hit the rear of the engine. It wouldn't make any difference which way I was turned, because all I had was just a single engine. So it wouldn't have mattered. In effect, yes, it would be like a head-on crash. I know that I had a lot of close experiences on the railroad. One night, we worked by hand signals and lantern signals. And at night, I was working and shoving about 50 cars into a track. And I could see the light. Well, if you see a light, well, you figure the man's there and he's watching, because we were around a curve. So I'm sitting there watching that light and shoving it. Boy, we ought to be down close to the other end by now. And I just happened to glance in the air and I saw a light flying in the air. And I stopped. The light that I saw, the fellow set the light down on the ground and got in the caboose and went to sleep. And the fellow that was at the other end, he said, last desperation, he says, I just threw that lantern as hard as I could and hoped you'd see it. And I did see it, and I got stopped. But that's certainly not all of them, but that's pretty much the caliber of people that I was working with at times. I had a fellow that threw a switch, lined us up with a passenger train, would have hit us, and I got on the horn and got him to throw it back, and he came up in the engine. I said, my God, what were you thinking about? He said, well, I was thinking about Ruthie. I said, Ruthie's going to get us killed. You keep that stuff up. But he was a heavy drinker. A lot of them were. One night I wanted to go home. I said, I hope we get finished so I can go home. And the guy said, why do you want to go home? I said, I'd rather be there than any place. He said, well, what in the hell are you doing working on the railroad? So, I don't know. I guess I didn't belong.
When did you start working on the railroad? Give us a little bit of background now. The wreck is interesting, but I'm interested in a bit of the history of you connected with the railroad. From being a child, where did you grow up?
On Morris Road, corner of Morris and School Street.
Okay, here in Kent.
My grandfather had a farm there.
All right, give us your bit of your history in the city of Kent and school and...
Well,
what year were you born?
1927.
Okay.
And my father had left my mother with 3 children. I had 2 older sisters. My father died when she was 3. Her mother died when she was 9, and she was put into an orphanage. She was adopted by my grandfather somewhere between 9 and 12 years old. And then when she was 16, her adopted mother died. So we moved in with my grandfather living by himself. And he was, without a doubt, the best influence on me anybody ever could be. He was very frugal with his money. They closed the city bank because of the Depression, and he had money in that bank. But he, fortunately, had 2 other rental properties that kept him Um, he said, you never pay interest, you collect interest. You never buy anything that you cannot afford to pay for. And it's worked out for me. And I was probably in my 30s before I realized the influence that this man had on me. Because I'm a carbon copy. I want dollar value, and I watch what I spend, and I don't spend money that I can't afford. And it's worked out very well for me. I know that a lot of people have made a lot of money on somebody else's money. But if you're in business, you have to do that. I understand that. Well, anyway, I grew up, and I had 2 ponies, and I used to go to Kent and sell rides on the ponies. Penny to ride in the sulky, and 3 cents to ride in the saddle on the other pony. I'd put the one pony behind on the sulky and with a saddle on it, and then I'd come to town. And later on, I got a horse. I was up Kent State riding across the campus, and it didn't do much good for the grass. And the groundskeeper came up to me, and boy, he was really giving me the devil. What are you doing riding this horse over here? And fortunately, the president of college, and I think at that time it was McGilvery, but I'm not sure, he just happened along, and he said, what's wrong? And I said, as a fellow told him, he saw a damn kid riding this horse across the grass. He came over to me and he said, I think that's beautiful, that horse going across that grass. And you come up here anytime you want to. He can fix the lawn, don't worry about that. I never went back. I thought, if I go back, I won't luck out, so I never did that again. But he said, oh, that's the most beautiful thing, seeing that horse going across that campus. Anyway, from there on, I went in the service, I went in February and got the last part of the war. I kept Hitler out of Ellis Island in New York for a while, and then I was transferred to New Orleans.
Did you see action during the war?
No.
You did.
Ellis Island was probably the hellhole of the world, though. You had people they were deporting there, and they had prisoners, military prisoners there. And the last boat was 9:30 in the evening, so you couldn't really go anyplace. And it was a dump. I haven't seen it since they fixed it up, but I didn't like it there very well. And then I went to New Orleans, and they said we're going to have the Mardi Gras. I said, that's great. What is it? I had no idea. But that was when it was a local thing, and it was great. And I've never been back down there since. But anyway, came back, went to work at Twin Coach, and I didn't like that at all. Worked in the sheet metal department, and I worked in the engineering department for a while. I picked the stanching and seating arrangements to go into buses, and an office job, but the union didn't like it because they said you're too young to have that job, but nobody else bid it in. I did. Left there, went to work for Carlozzi, and I worked in a body shop, and I was a mechanic. And then I went next door to Richardson's. They hired me as service manager, and they had a lot of antique cars, and I maintained those cars. The oldest one that I ever had was a 1898 Didion Bouton Vis-a-Vis. That's a French car, and it's set face to face, made in 1898. And I only had 2 speeds forward, no reverse. I picked it up in Cleveland, came in with a load of beer from Germany and shipped into Cleveland, and I picked it up there and brought it out, and it wouldn't run, and I fixed it up, got it running. That was the oldest one they had. But they had a couple Rolls Royces and Lancia, several of them. Anyway, sales were down. They weren't, by that time I was into sales, and the sales were down a little bit. And a friend of mine that worked on the railroad came in, and I said, you know, if there was another job right now, by God, I'd go to it. And he said, well, they need somebody. So I went to Meadville. They hired me, and I went to work that night. And Richardson said, now listen, you just tell them that you don't want that job, you're going to stay here. I said, no, I've already taken it. So I stayed on to that job. And I worked from 7:30 in the morning till 1:30 in the morning.
Doing what?
I was working in the garage. At that time I was back doing mechanical work. Mostly anything that they were stuck on, they'd leave it there for me. So I'd work full-time in the garage and full-time on the railroad. The railroad crews, that's 7 days a week. Engineers all work 7 days a week. Unless you're on a job that's different than that. The ground crews, they work 5 days a week in Kent. The engine crews, as I say, worked out of Meadville. So we just worked every day. And it really wasn't as bad as you'd think. We had no Monday morning blues anyhow. Working every day. But you could take off. 56, I got married, and I was still working both jobs. And I was on the Kent Fire Department beside that. So I had a pretty busy schedule. I worked, Saturdays I only worked 8 on the railroad and 4 in the garage, and then Sundays I only worked on the railroad 8 hours. But I knew that if I would work for wages, 10 years down the road I'd still be working for wages, and I wouldn't be any better off. So the only way to get ahead of the game was to work and get enough money to live on, and then have another salary coming in that I could invest. And I had a customer that came in, Porter. His son's still in the business.
Porter Hole?
Yeah. His son, or his father was, I can't think of his name. He was a stockbroker, and he came into the garage, and I got talking to him, and I said, you know, I'd like to invest in some stocks. So he said, I have a good stock. He said, try it. It's a telephone company out in western part of Ohio, and he said, I'm sure they're going to be taken over. So I bought that, and sure enough, they were taken over, and I did well on that. And I knew that I wasn't going to get rich overnight. The worst thing people think is they're going to invest in the stock market. They're going to hit a bonanza and make a fortune. Well, it doesn't work that way. But I did buy a mutual fund in '70. I put $2,000 into it, and I gave part of it to each one of my grandsons. And they ended up, well, they still have it, as a matter of fact. They still have some of it. They sold $10,000 worth when they got out of school to buy a car, and they still have money left over. And I still have some of it. But that $2,000 investment turned out to be worth about $50,000 or $60,000.
Wow.
But it took a lot of years. See, that was from 1970 up until, let's see, 81, that was the year he was born, 89, somewhere around in there. I had it that long. Anyway, I get back to the railroad. I generally worked a yard engine, but they had a job out of Kent that was called a way freight. This was later on, the way freight would leave Kent in the morning about 8 o'clock, and we'd get back in about 5 in the evening. We'd go down and switch out Ravenna, Harsno, we used to go in there, and we'd go just north of Warren, and then coming back we'd switch out to ones on the westbound track.
What was your job on this?
At that time I was, let's see, I don't remember the dates, but I moved up the roster fast because there were a lot of real old engineers on the railroad. When I started on the railroad, I worked with Claude Hartley, and he was working the third shift at night from midnight to 8 in the morning, That's the best job he could hold. And I had this wreck. I was working an engineer in the daytime, which was, you don't move up generally that fast, but a lot of the old ones were retiring or dying off, and so I moved up fast.
And you learned on the job
Oh yeah.
to be an engineer.
Oh yeah.
There were no classes as such.
No, but when they promote you, you have to go and take about 3 days of questioning. Oddly enough, I was a mechanic and I'd worked on most things I worked on I'd never done before, like on the antiques, and sometimes we'd have to make parts or whatever, so I was fairly good on mechanical things. And I knew more about the engines probably than most people did, because I took an interest in it and I read the manuals and the books on it.
These are diesels?
Yes.
Okay.
So we had trouble, and we had an engine repairman that came over, and he always had a chew in his mouth, and he'd come up in the engine room and say, "Well, Dale, what do you think's wrong with this?" And he had no idea what to do with diesels, but under the union rules, I wasn't allowed to fix anything. So as soon as he could come over, I could fix it, and then everything was all right. Like a real wonderful guy, but he was different, that's all. You can just hear him yet. He's funny. Anyway, you have to take these tests and prove that you know the rules and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of, the rules on the railroad don't apply unless you have trouble. And if you have trouble, you better be going by the book. The first thing he asked me is, do you know what Rule 99 is? I said, yes, we have to protect our train. So when I go out there to wait for this train, the conductor walks up the track as a precaution, so he can, flag the train down. The signals are supposed to get him stopped, and the flagman's supposed to get him stopped. But if he doesn't stop, that's it. And that's what happened. First thing we did was take a man down to Crane Avenue, drop him off there to watch that switch, to keep it lined up. Then we go back out to the only other switch to the access to the main track, and we wait there. And there's not much more than that.
Is this the way it still operates today?
They tell me that the signals now, you can't run past a signal, it will automatically put the brake on. In fact, they have some engines down in Florida that they run by remote control.
No engineer at all?
No, nobody on the engine. Now that's not out on the road, that's in the yards that they run into. Out on the road, to my knowledge, I know that they have signals that will automatically put the brakes on. You can't run past a red signal. I don't know what happened in California when that commuter train hit. Maybe didn't have that kind of a signal. I don't know what happened there. I was not, oddly enough, when I was growing up, I didn't really want to be, they want to be a fireman, or they want to be an engineer on the railroad, or they want to be this or that. All I wanted to do was fly airplanes. And I love flying. And it wasn't until I'd go up in anything. I went up when I was about 7 years old over at Stowe, and all I can remember is it was an old crate of an airplane. And then later on, I got interested and bought that plane I was telling you about. And then after that wreck, I had to have a spinal fusion. And a year after I had it, I sneezed, and I was in bed, and I heard it break. And went back to the orthopedic surgeon. He said, "Well, it'll probably just keep disintegrating, because if it broke, it wasn't growing in the way it should." I said, "What about another operation?" He said, "Well, there really isn't anything we could do." He said, "You probably better count on it. It'll probably incapacitate you later in years." don't reach for things, don't stretch, don't bend, all of this stuff they told me not to do because I might injure the spinal cord. And in 1973, Dr. Jacobs had my back x-rayed, and it grew back. I don't know why. They said it wouldn't, but it did. But that time I built a new house, and I built on a little pond, and I'd come home at night and swim about every day if the water would allow me to do it. And I did some things that I probably shouldn't have done, but it came out all right. And that's about it, I guess.
It's a very interesting story.
I was telling a fellow one time all of the things. He said, you know, you ought to write a book. I don't know if anybody's that interested, really.
Well, it's interesting how vivid this wreck is in your mind.
Well,
I mean, you describe it in great detail.
It's, to me, it was traumatic to see that happen. And then I have a picture here of what, there it is right there. Now, this is a dining car, and it was laying over on its side, and there was one of the...
So actually this is the orientation of it?
Let me look here, I gotta... That would be level there, but it was laying over on its side, and he was laying down here, and the floor of the car was at an angle, and you go in a fun house where they have a thing on its side, and you can't tell which way is up. Well, that's the way that train
Christmas decoration is on there. You can see.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's another picture. Now, this engine has a steps and a fuel tank and drawbar, everything back here. Well, I don't know what happened. That's all gone.
This is your train here?
No, this is mine.
This is your train.
Yeah, right.
So this is the rear of that diesel.
Mm-hmm.
And you were going this way.
No.
Oh,
This way.
so,
You're going to lead him through the yard.
so he rammed you in the rear.
Mm-hmm.
He just kept coming.
Mm-hmm.
Did you try and speed up to?
There wouldn't be a chance in the world to do
Not
that.
a chance.
No.
He was coming at such a rate of
So
speed that there was.
That second time I looked there, well, they asked me at the hearing, how fast was he going? I said, well, I really don't know. Well, what would you guess? Was he going 100? I said, no, I don't think so. Well, was he going over 10? And I knew where he was going with that. And I said, well, at what particular point are we talking about? And he dropped it. So.
This is your engine here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I
you
think
were
they
up in
scrapped
here
that.
and you just jumped off that.
Mm-hmm. I think they scrapped that engine. I'm not sure. It's up in the yard there for several months, and I don't know. Oh, those are other pictures I did. This is not a good picture, but that's the yard in Kent. Where this happened is way on the other end of that. This is down there, Crane Avenue.
Yeah, I'll scan these and include them in the video so that people can get a chance to see that. Well, I mean, Dale, it's a very interesting story, and it's I think people will be interested in listening to the story. Safety glass, you can see there. This is his. This is the train that rammed you. Couldn't they tell approximately what rate of speed he was at by the type of damage?
They said between 60 65, they estimated. They do investigation. It was a year or more before they came out with their findings on that. But they do quite an investigation. They said that the impact was between 60 and 65 miles an hour. The turn that he came around had a 50 mile an hour limit on that, and he told me he was going 70 when he went around that turn. I don't know how he could tell me he was going 70 and look at his speedometer and not see that signal. See, like I say, they'll never know what happened to this man.
Yeah, this was taken sometimes later. It looks as if it's rusted.
No, that was taken right afterwards.
Oh, right afterwards. I'm trying to...
There's some people who took a lot of pictures, and some gave me some. And
yeah.
One guy, Aaron Ken, had one. He wanted me to come and look at them, and I never did. I said I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to remember too much. These pictures that I took when I had my airplane, that's over at that's the Crane Avenue Bridge.
Right.
And then this other one's downtown.
Right.
Now that would have been about 1953 that I took those pictures.
Yeah, the Kent block is still there. Let's see. The Opera House is still there, so it's pre-1964.
I remember the Opera House. You go down there for 5 cents. You go in.
Oh yeah, tell me about the Opera House. And we got some time. I would like to hear your stories.
Well, actually it's a shame they tore it down. It was
I
a
agree.
beautiful vaudeville theater.
I agree.
And I loved vaudeville shows. I just thought they were the greatest. And they did have it come back for a little while. They had a few shows. I saw one in Cleveland, and in Akron too. But the Opera House, we had two theaters. Kent Theater cost 10 cents to go in there, and 5 cents to go in the Opera House. And the Opera House generally show 2 or 3 pictures and give away dishes and everything else. But it was a beautiful old theater. It needed some restoration, but that building and the courthouse in Ravenna, I don't know why they ever tore that down. It's just a beautiful building, and they tore it down. We don't have a lot of old buildings. If you travel to Europe and you see all these old structures over there, Notre Dame Cathedral, they started building that in the year 1100 and finished it in 1300 something. But you see all these old, beautiful places, and we don't have that here because we're not old enough to have that. But what we did have, we've destroyed a lot of it. And they say, well, that's progress. I don't know. It depends on how you define progress. Is that really progress to tear a beautiful building with a lot of history down and replace it with something else? Particularly if it's a parking lot. I can remember when I was little, if I wanted to go someplace or do anything, I'd make some money for myself. I'd go back and get bittersweet and sassafras roots and bundle them up and take them to town to sell them. And the best customer I had was Martin L. Davy. He lived over on Main Street, and if he was home when I'd go there, well, he'd buy everything I had. I just thought he was the greatest thing in the world. Wasn't always there, but he was one of my customers.
Was he the mayor at that time?
He was the governor at that time.
Oh, he was the governor at that time.
Yep. And I'd collect scrap, any scrap iron or papers or anything like that.
You were a very resourceful young man.
Well, again, I go back to my grandfather. Now, this man was not any blood relation to me at all. And he never said much about his childhood. I had a picture of him and his brother, but I didn't know where. It was an old tintype. I still have it. And I didn't know where it was taken. And I found a niece that was still living, the last living relative that I know that he had. And she was in a nursing home over in Stowe. And I went over and And I showed her that picture. I said, can you tell me where that was taken? She says, oh yes. The family, he grew up in a log cabin on a farm over in Akron. And she said that was the well. They had to walk up to get their water from that well. And in 1933, he took a trip with his two nieces, this one that I was talking about and another one. They went to California. They bought a new Pearson automobile. And he told me she told me, he didn't tell me. She told me from St. Louis to California was all dirt road. 1933. Quite a trip. And he used to tell me something about the trip. But he generally was not a man of a lot of words. I'd worked with him. They used to kid in the neighborhood when I was little. They said if he'd stop, you'd run into him because I was followed him every place. And I didn't realize the effect that this man had on me. But I guess when you're growing up, you do what you see other people do, and you listen to them.
What was his name?
Frank Hellwig. He had, let's see, about 15 or 18 acres or so on the corner of Morris and School Street. There's apartment houses there now. And the old farmhouse he rented that out, and then he had a house in Akron that he rented. And he worked at Mason Tire, and he farmed. But he farmed with a lot of it, most of it by hand. I saw him spade an acre.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of spading.
Yeah, it is. He worked from daylight to dark. He never would eat white bread. He drank postum, never drank coffee. And he made 3 barrels of wine every year.
Wow.
And he'd have a glass of wine. When I was little, I used to go down and have maybe half a glass of wine with him myself. Never had a cavity. He died, he was 82. He was up doing something on the roof and he injured his leg. And he doctored himself. He had a salve that he used on the cows and the horses and on himself. But it didn't do a very good job. And he waited too long and gangrene set in. And I took him to the hospital. And we were going over. He said, slow down a little bit. He said, I want to look things over. I won't be coming back. I said, sure you will. He said, no, I won't. This is it. And he was never sick that I remember ever being sick. Very unusual. But some of those old timers were hardy because the other ones didn't survive. If I'd have been born in the 1800s, I had appendicitis, I had blood poisoning. Either one would have killed me back then.
Well, it's very interesting, and I think we should end it here. You probably could use a drink of water about this point, it sounds like.